Ayatollah Ali Khamenei wasn't a celebrity scandal figure. He was a state power center. From 1989 until his reported death in 2026, Khamenei served as Iran's supreme leader, holding ultimate authority over the armed forces, security institutions, the judiciary, state broadcasting, and the country's general direction in foreign policy. That's why scandals tied to him are usually not about private life. They're about how power is used and how decisions ripple through protests, prisons, sanctions, and wars. Reuters' obituary-style reporting described his rule as defined by uncompromising internal control and hostility toward the U.S. and Israel, with repeated crackdowns on mass protests and a strategy of building regional influence through allied groups. This is also why Khamenei's controversies are hard to pin to one smoking gun. In Iran's system, the supreme leader is often above day-to-day government, but he can shape outcomes through public speeches, appointments, and the security architecture. That creates a recurring pattern in global coverage. Whenever unrest erupts, critics point to Khamenei as the final political authority. Supporters argue he is defending stability and sovereignty. In practice, the same cycle repeats. A crisis begins on the streets, then a supreme leader statement frames it as foreign instigated or threatening to the Islamic Republic, and security forces respond. The story becomes a tug-of-war between human rights allegations and state security narratives. In 2026, the story took an extraordinary turn. Reuters and AP both reported that Iranian state media confirmed Khamenei's death, saying it followed a joint U.S.-Israeli operation, airstrike targeting Iran's top leadership, and that President Donald Trump publicly claimed he was dead. Whether your channel focuses on scandal, political deep dives, or geopolitical breakdowns, this ending instantly reframes the entire retrospective. What does a near four-decade rule leave behind? Especially one repeatedly criticized for repression and celebrated by supporters as resistance. So the structure of this series is simple. We'll track the biggest controversy lanes associated with Khamenei: 1. Crackdowns and rights allegations; 2. Opaque wealth power networks and succession fears; 3. Sanctions and international isolation; 4. Nuclear policy and proxy conflicts, then end with how his reported death triggers the next power struggle. Khamenei's most persistent scandal lane in international media is repression, not a single event, but repeated waves. A key early landmark was the 2009 Green Movement, sparked by a disputed presidential election. Reuters reported that Khamenei demanded an end to street protests and warned that any bloodshed would be the opposition leader's responsibility. Human rights organizations documented the escalation that followed: violent dispersals, mass arrests, and the iconic footage of Neda Aga Sultan's death that circled the world. For your channel, this moment matters because it created a template. Khamenei speaks, the state draws a line, and the crackdown becomes a global story. A decade later, November 2019 became another defining chapter. When fuel prices rose, protests spread rapidly. Reuters published a special report saying Khamenei ordered security forces to end unrest, captured in the now famous summary, "Do whatever it takes." That report also described the crackdown as exceptionally lethal, with disputed death toll figures reported by different sources. The exact numbers remain contested, but the central controversy is consistent across coverage. The state used overwhelming force, and critics argued the supreme leader's posture signaled approval for repression. Then came 2022. After the death of Mahsa Amini while in custody, which triggered nationwide protests and international condemnation. Reuters and other outlets described this period as one of the most serious internal challenges to the Islamic Republic in years, with extensive arrests and violence reported amid official denials and counterclaims. Even without repeating every statistic, the pattern matters for storytelling. Each time unrest emerges, Khamenei's leadership is portrayed by critics as choosing coercion over reform, while state media and supporters frame it as protecting Iran from chaos and foreign interference. If you want a scandal channel angle that stays factual, focus less on sensational claims and more on the mechanism of escalation. How protests move from economic grievance to political challenge, how state rhetoric frames dissent, how internet restrictions appear, and how international human rights scrutiny collides with Iran's sovereignty narrative. The second controversy lane isn't about street clashes, it's about money governance and transparency. In 2013, Reuters Investigates published Assets of the Ayatollah, reporting that a network known as Setad, execution of Imam Khomeini's order, built a vast economic empire through property seizures and corporate holdings. Reuters estimated Setad's value at around $95 billion, based on analysis of official statements, market data, and public information, including U.S. Treasury references. To supporters, organizations like Setad are often framed as foundations serving national or religious goals. To critics, they represent the opposite, a shadow economy tied to the Supreme Leader's office with limited public oversight. This matters because it connects to a broader scandal narrative. Iran is regularly described as suffering from economic hardship, sanctions pressure, and inflation. Yet investigations and sanctions documents suggest the Supreme Leader's office is linked to major pools of assets. U.S. Sanctions documentation from 2019 explicitly targeted Iran's Supreme Leader's office and persons appointed by or connected to it. Whether one views this as legitimate governance or corrupt patronage, it's a controversy that fuels mistrust and anger, especially when protesters chant about elites and privilege. Then there's the long-running succession question, often framed as a dynasty problem. Reuters reported in 2025 that Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, is a powerful behind-the-scenes figure with deep ties to the Revolutionary Guard and Basij networks, seen by some as a potential successor, despite lacking the traditional clerical stature expected of the role. Reuters also noted that this perception stokes criticism because the Islamic Republic was founded on anti-monarchist ideals. This becomes scandal in the political sense, a republic accused of sliding toward hereditary power. A strong way to end this part is a single question. If the same office is linked, by critics and sanctions policies, to both security control and opaque wealth, how does accountability work when the system is under stress? You don't need to answer it. The tension itself drives viewers into Part 4. Internationally, Khamenei's controversies often appear through a geopolitical frame: nuclear escalation plus sanctions plus regional conflict. Reuters' retrospective reporting described his long rule as tied to Iran's expanding nuclear program and consistent hostility toward the U.S. and Israel, while Iran rejected accusations that it sought nuclear weapons. Khamenei is also frequently associated by supporters as a symbol of resistance against Western domination, and by critics as a driver of isolation and militarization. A key ingredient in the narrative is that sanctions became personal and institutional. In June 2019, Reuters reported the Trump administration imposed sanctions on Khamenei and other top officials in an unprecedented escalation, intended to lock up assets and increase pressure. The U.S., Treasury's opaque notice explains that the executive order imposed sanctions on the Supreme Leader's office and targeted people appointed by the Supreme Leader and/or his office. If you're building a scandal-style episode, sanctions work well as receipts because they're official documents, though they reflect a political stance, not a court verdict. Then there's the proxy dimension. Reuters' 2026 reporting described Iran under Khamenei as backing allied groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and Yemen's Houthis, and intervening in Syria to support Bashar al-Assad, elements that shaped Iran's regional influence and conflicts with Israel and the U.S. Even if your viewers don't follow Middle East politics, you can explain why this matters. Proxy networks extend Iran's reach, but also expose it to retaliation, sanctions, and prolonged confrontation. Finally, a controversy that shows how domestic and foreign crises collide. The PS-752 tragedy. Reuters reported that Iran acknowledged in January 2020 that its military shot down a Ukrainian passenger plane, killing 176 people after days of denial, describing it as a disastrous mistake. Canada's official factual analysis states the IRGC shot down flight PS-752 shortly after takeoff from Tehran. This isn't always framed directly as Khamenei's scandal, but as a defining state crisis under his rule, fueling protests and distrust. For decades, Khamenei's controversies were debated in cycles: protest, crackdowns, sanctions, escalation, stalemate. But in 2026, the story reportedly ended in a way few expected. Reuters reported Iranian state media confirmed Khamenei was killed in a U.S. Israeli strike, and AP similarly reported his death following a joint operation. This is an ending twist that instantly turns a controversy dossier into a succession thriller. Who controls Iran now, and what happens to the security apparatus, the economic networks, and the regional strategy associated with his era? To close a scandal-style video responsibly, you can frame his legacy in 3 controversy buckets without pretending to deliver legal judgments. 1. Repression and rights allegations. From 2009 to 2019 to 2022, international reporting and human rights documentation repeatedly described major crackdowns and mass arrests. The scandal isn't just violence, it's the recurring accusation that the system is designed to crush dissent and that Khamenei was the ultimate political guardian of that design. 2. Opaque wealth and elite protection. Reuters' Setad investigation and U.S. Sanctions documentation are frequently cited by critics as evidence of a shadow economy connected to the Supreme Leader's office. Whether one sees it as national foundations or corruption, the controversy remains. The public rarely gets full transparency. 3. Permanent confrontation abroad. Nuclear tensions, proxy networks, and sanctions formed a feedback loop that shaped Iran's economy and security posture for decades. Reuters' 2026 overview frames his era as deeply defined by hostility to the U.S. and Israel and by regional alliances and conflicts. Now the next episode hook writes itself: succession. AP reported the Assembly of Experts will name a new supreme leader, while the Revolutionary Guard remains a decisive force, meaning the post-Khamenei era could become either reform, retrenchment, or internal power struggle. If you want part 2 of this series, you can focus entirely on how succession works and why Mojtaba Khamenei is often mentioned in speculation.